They thought it was a joke, handing me a worthless lottery ticket while my sister got a house. They laughed at me, mocked me, and treated me like nothing. But destiny had other plans. That very ticket changed my life forever, and theirs too. Today, I'm here to share how betrayal, humiliation, and one twist of fate turned me into someone they could never ignore again. They say family is supposed to be your safe place, the people who will stand by you no matter what. But sometimes, family can be the very ones who cut the deepest. For me, the hurt didn't come from strangers or enemies, it came from the people who shared my own blood. My sister was always the favorite. From the very beginning, it seemed like everything in our household revolved around her. She was praised for the smallest things, showered with gifts, and treated like she was a shining star, while I stood in the shadows, waiting for the kind of acknowledgement that never came. The difference between us wasn't in our abilities or potential, it was simply in how my family chose to see us. They put her on a pedestal, and me? They barely noticed. When the time came for big decisions and gestures, the favoritism grew louder than ever. I remember the day vividly. It was a family gathering, one of those occasions where everyone is smiling on the surface, but there's tension running underneath. My parents made a grand announcement. They told my sister they were giving her a house. A whole house. It was celebrated with applause, hugs, and endless words of congratulations. Cameras came out to capture the moment, and relatives whispered among themselves about how lucky she was. And then came my turn. I didn't expect a house. I didn't expect something so grand. But I did expect something meaningful, something that at least showed I mattered. Instead, they handed me a lottery ticket. A slip of paper worth almost nothing in their eyes. At first, I thought it was a joke. I even looked around, waiting for them to laugh and say they had something else for me. But the laughter wasn't from a shared joke, it was directed at me. My father smirked. My mother shrugged. My sister chuckled with that mocking tone only siblings can perfect. The relatives joined in, as if I was the punchline of some cruel family comedy. In that moment, I felt my stomach sink and my chest tighten. It wasn't just about the gift, it was about what the gift symbolized. To them, I was worth scraps. I was worth a piece of paper that would almost certainly amount to nothing. My value, in their eyes, was no more than a gamble, a chance, an afterthought. Humiliation like that has a way of searing itself into your memory. Every chuckle, every dismissive glance, every word that implied I was less, that day replayed in my head over and over. I sat there with that lottery ticket in my hand, trying to keep a straight face, trying not to let them see the hurt that was burning inside me. But inside, I was crumbling. It wasn't about greed. It wasn't about wanting material things. It was about dignity. It was about being seen as equal, as worthy, as someone who deserved love and respect just as much as my sister. Instead, I was made into a joke, a side character in the story of their golden child. The more I thought about it, the more it stung. It wasn't just that day. It was a pattern, a long line of choices and behaviors that made it clear where I stood in the hierarchy of my family. My sister was the queen, and I was the servant. She was showered with everything, while I had to fight for scraps of attention. They didn't see my struggles, my efforts, or my quiet strength. They only saw what they wanted to see, someone less deserving, someone who could be mocked without consequence. And the cruelest part? They didn't even try to hide it. They laughed openly, because to them, my pain was entertaining. That night, I sat alone in my room, holding that ticket. It wasn't just paper, it was the physical proof of their dismissal. My mind replayed every little moment of favoritism, every word that cut deeper than they realized. The house for my sister was a crown on her head, while my lottery ticket was a crown of thorns. It was a clear message. She is everything, you're nothing. I tried to reason with myself, to think maybe it wasn't intentional, maybe they didn't mean to hurt me. But the memory of their laughter crushed every excuse I tried to make for them. It was intentional. They wanted me to know my place. In that painful moment, I began to feel a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, betrayal, and a strange sense of determination. If they thought this lottery ticket defined me, they were wrong. If they thought I was nothing more than a joke, they were underestimating me. The humiliation carved something deep inside of me, something that wouldn't be erased easily. I realized that day that sometimes the people closest to you can be the ones who diminish you the most, and the only way to rise is to prove them wrong, not through shouting, not through begging, but through actions that speak louder than their mockery ever could. The lottery ticket they gave me wasn't handed over with love, thought, or even the smallest trace of respect. It was passed to me like a prop, a tool for their amusement, as though my life and my worth were nothing more than the setup for a family joke. I can still picture the smirks on their faces, the way their eyes sparkled with a cruel kind of delight as they presented me with that thin slip of paper. My sister had just been given a house, a place she could call her own, walls to decorate, rooms to fill with memories, security for her future. And me? I was handed something that felt as empty as the way they looked at me. A lottery ticket. A gamble. A joke. At first, I didn't even know how to respond. I held it between my fingers, forcing a smile, trying to convince myself that maybe this was meant as something lighthearted, something playful. But the laughter around me quickly proved otherwise. The chuckles weren't warm, they weren't kind. They were sharp, mocking, deliberate. My parents, the people who were supposed to protect me, joined in the ridicule. My sister laughed the loudest, her new house keys jingling in her hand like a crown of victory. And I stood there, clutching a lottery ticket, with everyone watching me as though I had just been crowned the fool of the family. That ticket became more than just paper. It was the embodiment of every insult they had ever thrown my way without words. It was them saying, "You're not worth investing in. You're not worth security. You're not worth anything real." It was their way of putting me in my place, drawing a line between the chosen one and the forgotten one. In that single moment, I felt the full weight of being unwanted, of being the child who would never measure up no matter what I did. They didn't even try to disguise it. The ticket wasn't wrapped in an envelope or given with even a hint of ceremony. It was tossed to me like spare change, like something that didn't matter. And yet, to them, it mattered enough to laugh at. I tried to imagine what they thought would happen. Did they think I would laugh with them? Did they expect me to scratch it off right there, shrug, and accept my role as the family's punchline? Or did they not even care enough to think about it at all? Maybe it was just a spur-of-the-moment decision, a careless gesture that revealed far more about how they truly saw me than any words ever could. What they didn't realize was that the cruelty of that gift cut far deeper than they could ever imagine. Every time I looked at that ticket, it wasn't numbers I saw, it was their faces, their laughter, their blatant declaration that I was worth nothing. It wasn't the first time I'd been treated like the afterthought. Birthdays came and went, with my sister's celebrated like national holidays and mine passed off with half-hearted gestures. Achievements I worked for were brushed aside while hers, no matter how small, were placed on pedestals. But the lottery ticket, that was different. That wasn't just neglect. That was intentional mockery, a deliberate act designed to humiliate. And because it was done so openly, with relatives and extended family present, the humiliation was amplified. It wasn't just me they laughed at, it was my entire existence, my very identity. I remember staring at the ticket later that night, running my thumb across its smooth surface, wondering what it would be like if it actually held something more than mockery. The irony was heavy. The ticket was supposed to symbolize chance, luck, the rare miracle of fortune smiling on you. To me, it symbolized the exact opposite. It was a reminder that in my family's eyes, my worth was a gamble at best, disposable at worst. They hadn't given me hope, they had given me a symbol of hopelessness, dressed up as a joke. The pain of that moment wasn't just in the gift itself, but in the way it stripped me bare in front of everyone. I could feel their eyes on me as I held the ticket, waiting to see if I would break, if I would show my hurt. It was as though they wanted confirmation that I accepted my role, that I knew I was lesser. But what they didn't see was the storm brewing inside of me. Their joke, their laughter, their cruel gift planted something deeper than hurt. It planted a seed of resolve. Even in that moment of humiliation, I knew that this lottery ticket, meaningless as it seemed, was going to be more than what they intended. Because for them, it was a punchline. For me, it became a reminder, a trigger, a symbol of everything I would one day rise above. Every smirk, every careless word, every mocking laugh echoed in my mind. They had no idea that what they meant as an insult would one day become the very thing that fueled me. And while they saw the ticket as worthless, I began to see it as something else entirely, a mirror reflecting exactly who they were and exactly who I refused to be. I still remember the night I scratched that ticket. It wasn't with excitement, it wasn't with hope, and it wasn't with any sense of anticipation. I wasn't expecting anything at all because in my mind, the ticket was worthless, a cruel reminder of the way my family mocked me. For days, I let it sit untouched, tucked away in the corner of my drawer. Every time I looked at it, I didn't see a possibility of fortune. I saw the smirks of my parents, the mocking laughter of my sister, and the way the relatives whispered behind their hands as though my humiliation was entertainment. But something in me, a mixture of defiance and curiosity, pushed me to finally scratch it. It wasn't because I cared about winning, it was because I wanted to prove, once and for all, that it was just as worthless as the way they saw me. I sat at my desk with a coin in hand, dragging it slowly across the surface of the ticket. At first, it was nothing, just numbers, just symbols, just confirmation of what I already believed. I scratched off one row, then another, my mind half elsewhere, already thinking about the sting of the memory. And then, suddenly, my eyes locked on the numbers. I blinked, thinking I had misread it. I leaned closer, rubbed my eyes, and checked again. My heart started to pound so hard I could feel it in my throat. The numbers lined up in a way I had never dared imagine. I checked again, my fingers trembling as the realization began to sink in. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. But the ticket was telling me otherwise. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the official results, my hands shaking so badly I could barely type. When the page loaded and the numbers matched, I felt the world tilt beneath me. I read them once, then twice, then 10 times, each repetition driving the reality deeper into my chest. The ticket, the same ticket they had mocked me for, the same ticket they had tossed at me like trash, was worth $68 million. $68 million. The kind of money that changes everything, the kind of money that builds futures, the kind of money that could never be dismissed as a joke. At first, I couldn't even breathe. My mind was a whirlwind of disbelief and shock. It was as if time froze and the room around me disappeared. All I could see were those numbers, glowing like they were alive, shouting at me that this was real, that it was happening, that fate had just turned the cruelest joke into the most powerful twist. My hands shook as I held the ticket tighter, afraid that if I let go, it would vanish into thin air. Afraid that it was just a dream I would wake from. Afraid that somehow I had made a mistake. But no matter how many times I checked, no matter how many times I compared, the truth remained the same. I was holding a ticket worth $68 million. I sat there in silence, trying to process the impossible. The laughter of my family echoed in my mind, only this time, it didn't sting, it fueled the surreal joy flooding through me. The very thing they gave me to belittle me had become the key to a fortune none of them could ever have imagined. My humiliation had turned into my triumph, and it happened without me lifting a finger. It wasn't revenge I had planned, it wasn't justice I had sought, it was fate, pure and undeniable, that had decided the tables were going to turn. The weight of the moment pressed down on me. $68 million wasn't just money, it was freedom. Freedom from their judgment, freedom from their control, freedom from the chains of being the forgotten one. All my life, I had been told, in subtle and not-so-subtle ways, that I wasn't enough. But in that moment, as I sat there with trembling hands and wide eyes, I realized I was more than enough. More than they could ever measure, more than they could ever limit. This ticket, this slip of paper they had tossed at me like an insult, had become the most powerful tool in my life. Shock turned into disbelief, disbelief into awe, and awe into a flood of emotions I couldn't contain. Tears stung my eyes, not from sadness this time, but from the overwhelming rush of what this meant. My future was no longer in their hands. My worth was no longer defined by their laughter. My life, in one single moment, had been rewritten. I thought about the countless nights I lay awake wondering why I wasn't good enough, why I was treated like less, why my existence seemed like a burden instead of a blessing. And now, here I was, staring at a ticket that proved destiny had been listening all along. The irony was almost too much to comprehend. They had given me this ticket to make fun of me, to highlight my supposed unworthiness. They had laughed because they believed nothing would come of it, because in their minds, I was destined for nothing. And yet, that very act, that careless gesture, had unlocked something they could never have foreseen. The ticket that was supposed to humiliate me had transformed into the ultimate equalizer, the symbol of everything they could never take away from me again. The moment the reality of winning $68 million settled into my bones, I knew everything had shifted. Not just in my bank account, not just in the numbers on a screen, but in the invisible balance of power that had always weighed against me. For years, I had lived under the shadow of being the lesser one, the overlooked child, the one whose value was measured against my sister's shine and always found lacking. Every word from my parents, every sideways glance from relatives, every dismissive laugh had reinforced the same truth. They had the power, and I was left with nothing but scraps. But now, the ground beneath us had moved. What they thought was a harmless joke had handed me the kind of power they could never take back. It was strange at first, realizing that the dynamics were no longer the same. I had spent so long believing that I had no control, no leverage, that the idea of being on the other side felt almost unreal. When I looked at my family after the win, it wasn't me who had changed in essence, it was the way they looked at me. Their eyes no longer carried that lazy dismissal, that subtle superiority. Instead, I saw flashes of uncertainty, curiosity, even fear. They didn't say it out loud, but I could feel it in the way their conversations shifted, in the pauses that hadn't been there before, in the way they stumbled over words when speaking to me. Money has a way of changing people, not because it alters who you are, but because it forces them to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about you. Before, my sister was the crown jewel. She had the house, the attention, the approval. My parents lavished her with resources and respect, while I was expected to settle for less. But after the win, the glow around her began to dim. Not because she had changed, but because the contrast between us had flipped. She was still the one with a house, yes, but I was the one with the kind of wealth that made her house look small. The same relatives who once praised her endlessly now whispered about me, eyes wide with fascination. I could feel the axis tilting every time someone brought up my name. I was no longer the punchline, I was the headline. The transformation wasn't just external. Inside me, something unshackled. I no longer felt the need to shrink myself to fit the role they had written for me. I walked differently, spoke differently, carried myself with a quiet assurance that came from knowing I no longer had to beg for their respect. For so long, they had held the power of making me feel small, but now, their approval meant nothing. I didn't need their validation to breathe, to stand, to exist. $68 million didn't just give me freedom, it gave me the power to redefine myself on my own terms. And the beauty of it all was that they knew it too. I could see it in my father's eyes when he tried to joke with me, the way his laughter faltered, unsure if he was still allowed to treat me like the butt of the joke. I saw it in my mother's sudden attempts to be softer, more considerate, as though money had opened her eyes to a value she had refused to see before. And my sister, her smugness was still there, but it was cracked now, thin enough that I could see the jealousy simmering beneath. She had been given a house, I had stumbled into a fortune. The balance they had carefully constructed for years had collapsed overnight, and none of them knew how to rebuild it. The shift in power wasn't about rubbing it in their faces. It wasn't about parading my win or flaunting my wealth. It was subtler, quieter, more profound. The power was in knowing I no longer owed them anything. I didn't have to chase their love or acceptance, because I had built my own foundation, one they could never tear down. For the first time in my life, I looked at them without the weight of desperation. I didn't need them to see me as worthy, because my worth was no longer in their hands. What struck me most was how quickly their behavior began to shift. The same relatives who had laughed with them now approached me with careful words and polite smiles. Invitations began to arrive, thinly veiled attempts to draw me into their circles. Suddenly, I wasn't invisible anymore. I was the center of attention. But it was different from my sister's spotlight. Her glow came from favoritism, from being handed opportunities. Mine came from a twist of fate that gave me more than they could ever provide. And because of that, Their admiration was tinged with something else, dependence. They needed me now more than I ever needed them. The power dynamic wasn't just about money, it was about respect, about the undeniable fact that I had risen beyond the role they had forced on me. Every conversation, every interaction became a reminder of that shift. They could no longer laugh freely at my expense. They could no longer dismiss my presence. Even in silence, the weight of my win hung between us, reshaping the air we breathed together. For so long, they had held the upper hand, dictating who I was allowed to be, what I was allowed to have, how much space I was allowed to take up in the family. But now, that control had evaporated. I no longer fit into the box they had built for me. I had outgrown it, shattered it, and replaced it with something they couldn't contain. The transformation of power was not loud or explosive. It was steady, undeniable, and irreversible. Every time I looked at them, I could see it in their eyes, the knowledge that the balance had shifted forever. Respect is something I had begged for all my life without even realizing it. It wasn't money I craved, it wasn't gifts or luxuries, it was the simple dignity of being treated as though I mattered just as much as anyone else in the family. But in their eyes, I had always been the one who didn't measure up, the one who could be overlooked, the one who could be mocked without consequence. They handed me that lottery ticket as proof of where I stood in their hierarchy, a pawn in their game, a figure to laugh at, someone who didn't deserve real acknowledgement. And yet, when fate twisted the joke back on them, I found myself standing in a place where I no longer had to demand their respect. I had the chance to teach them what it truly meant. Teaching them wasn't about revenge, though the temptation was always there, simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't about throwing my wealth in their faces or turning my back on them with cruelty. It was about letting them feel the weight of their own actions, showing them that respect isn't something you hand out when it's convenient, and it isn't something you withhold as punishment. Respect is a constant, a recognition of humanity, a baseline of dignity that should never be denied. They had denied me that dignity for years, and now, with $68 million in my hands, I had the means to make them face the consequences of their choices. The first lesson came in silence. I didn't announce my win to them right away. I let the ticket sit, claimed the money quietly, and carried on without saying a word. In those days, I noticed the subtle ways they still treated me as small, still carried themselves as though they were above me. But this time, their words didn't pierce me. They didn't define me. They were echoes of a world that no longer existed. And when the truth finally reached them, when they discovered that the ticket they had mocked had turned me into a millionaire, the silence that followed was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. For once, they had no laughter, no jokes, no smug remarks. They had only stunned faces and the weight of their own arrogance pressing down on them. Respect, I realized, was not something I had to ask for anymore. It was something they owed, something they were forced to give when the ground shifted beneath their feet. I taught them by refusing to shrink. When they tried to approach me with half-hearted apologies or awkward attempts to reconnect, I didn't lash out. I didn't explode with anger. I simply stood tall, calm, and unshaken. I spoke with confidence, carried myself with composure, and let the contrast between who I had been and who I had become do the teaching for me. They could no longer see me as the fool, because I refused to play the role. But the lesson went deeper than my silence. I began to make choices that reflected the respect I had always wanted for myself. When they asked for help, I didn't slam the door in their faces. Instead, I set boundaries. Clear, firm, unshakable boundaries that reminded them I was not their pawn anymore. If they wanted something from me, they had to come with honesty, with humility, with recognition of the way they had treated me. I didn't buy their affection. I didn't hand out money to earn their love. Instead, I taught them that my generosity was tied to their willingness to treat me as an equal, as someone worthy of basic decency. Watching them struggle with this shift was its own lesson. My sister, once the queen of the family, had to come to terms with the fact that her crown had slipped. She no longer held all the attention, all the admiration. And when she came to me, her voice softer, her words more careful, I knew the lesson had begun to sink in. Respect wasn't about who had been favored in the past, it was about who stood firm in the present. My parents, too, began to adjust. The smirks vanished, the dismissive tones faded. They tried to mask their regret with politeness, but the change in their eyes was undeniable. They looked at me not as a child to control, but as a force they could no longer ignore. The greatest lesson, however, wasn't in the way I treated them, but in the way I treated myself. For the first time in my life, I respected myself enough to stop begging for their approval. I stopped trying to prove my worth to people who had chosen not to see it. Instead, I invested in my own growth, my own happiness, my own future. I surrounded myself with people who valued me for who I was, not for what I could provide. In doing so, I showed my family that respect begins within. They couldn't take it from me anymore because I no longer handed them the power to define me. As the months went on, I noticed the shift solidifying. They spoke to me differently, not with mockery but with caution. They walked around me not with arrogance, but with a quiet recognition of the balance that had changed. And while their newfound respect might have been born out of money, I knew the deeper lesson was clear. The ticket had not just given me wealth, it had forced them to confront the truth they had ignored for years. I was never the fool, never the lesser one. They had made me into that in their own minds, but fate had torn that illusion apart. And now, every time they looked at me, they saw what they had refused to see before, a person worthy of respect, not because of money, but because I had claimed it for myself and taught them they had no right to deny it. Victory didn't come in the way movies often portray it. There was no grand scene of me standing in front of my family, yelling out everything they had done wrong, no dramatic speeches or doors slammed in their faces. My triumph came in a quieter, sharper form, through silence. Silence has a weight they never understood until it fell on them like a mirror, forcing them to see themselves. I didn't need to shout, I didn't need to humiliate them as they had humiliated me. The win itself, the life I built from it, and the way I carried myself afterwards spoke louder than any words I could have thrown at them. Silence became my most powerful tool. When they first learned about the lottery win, I didn't gloat. I didn't remind them of the night they laughed at me as I held that ticket. I didn't replay their mockery or throw their cruelty back in their faces. Instead, I simply allowed the truth to exist. They remembered without me having to say a word. The memory of their laughter came back to them every time they thought of how that very ticket had changed everything. My silence didn't just withhold words, it magnified their own. It forced them to sit with what they had said, what they had done, and what it had cost them. At family gatherings, I noticed the difference. Where once I had been the background, now eyes followed me. Where once I had been dismissed, now every word I spoke carried weight. And yet, I didn't overuse that power. I chose silence instead. While they scrambled to fill conversations, to smooth over the awkwardness, I let the pauses linger. Those pauses were heavy, reminding them of the imbalance that had been corrected. They wanted me to lash out, maybe even expected it, because revenge would have been easier for them to digest. Revenge is loud, messy, and it burns quickly. Silence, however, lingers. It stays. It unsettles. The victory wasn't in showing them anger, it was in showing them peace. When they tried to bait me with small remarks, hoping to test whether the old dynamics still held, I didn't react. My calmness unnerved them more than any explosion could have. I smiled when they expected me to argue. I turned away when they expected me to beg for attention. Every time I refused to play the role they had written for me, the victory grew stronger. My silence taught them that their control was gone, their power stripped away not by force, but by the absence of reaction. I began to realize that silence isn't emptiness. It's presence. It's the deliberate choice not to give someone the satisfaction of your words. When I chose silence, I chose dignity. I chose to let my actions, my life, and my success speak in ways no speech ever could. My wealth became visible in the way I carried myself, the opportunities one created, the independence I claimed. They saw the difference without me needing to point it out. And every time they looked at me, the silence reminded them that they had built this wall themselves. They had laughed, they had mocked, they had dismissed. Now, I didn't need to tell them they were wrong, the silence told them for me. The sweetest part of this victory was watching how their behavior shifted in response. My sister, once so smug in her position as the favored one, began to soften around me. She spoke carefully, her voice stripped of the arrogance she had once wielded so easily. My parents, who had laughed along with her, now carried themselves differently, as though stepping lightly around me. They tried to bridge the gap with polite words, with small gestures, but the silence between us spoke louder than any attempt at reconciliation. They knew what they had done. They knew that I knew. And my refusal to voice it out loud left them with no escape, no defense. Even the relatives who had joined in the mockery now looked at me with new eyes. Some tried to align themselves with me, pretending they hadn't been part of the laughter, pretending their silence back then had been sympathy instead of complicity. I didn't call them out. I didn't confront them. I let the silence hang in the space between us, letting them squirm under the weight of their own memories. That silence taught them more than words ever could, I remembered, and I didn't need to say it for them to know. There's a particular strength in restraint. I had every opportunity to humiliate them the way they humiliated me, every chance to throw their cruelty back at them amplified by my success. But true victory doesn't come from repeating the same cruelty, it comes from breaking the cycle. My silence became the proof that I had risen above, that I had stepped into a place where their opinions no longer defined me. They could not touch me anymore, not with laughter, not with mockery, not with dismissal. And they knew it, because silence made them face their own actions without distraction. Every interaction with them became layered with that unspoken reminder. When I entered a room, the silence carried my story. When I smiled without explanation, the silence carried my triumph. When I listened without responding to their excuses, the silence carried their shame. It was in the unspoken that the lesson lived, sharper than any speech I could have given. They had taught me pain through their words, and I taught them respect through my silence. That was the victory, calm, steady, undeniable, and everlasting.